Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had an encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. Tonight's guest is Dave Leidy with the North American Dogman Project. If you listen to the show, you'll remember Dave from past episodes he's come on and done. The original guest I had lined up for tonight's show wasn't able to do it at the last moment, so I contacted Dave, asked if he'd be willing to come on and fill in, and he agreed luckily, so here he is. Dave, thanks so much for coming back. I really do appreciate it.
It's always my pleasure, Vic.
Oh, it's always great having you. For those listeners who haven't heard you on past shows, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, I'm 55 years old, married, no children, retired, usually from the Philadelphia area, though I do spend my summers in Vermont. I used to work for IT, and I did some dog training after that. I've had some encounters with various crypto entities. I have a couple of episodes on Dogman Encounters Radio. I have episode 95, where I had an encounter with a dogman in the swamps of North Carolina. And then after that, I was offered a position with the North American Dogman Project and went on to do some researching. And I researched a encounter in the area of Schwenksville, Pennsylvania. And I've continued to do that.
For anyone who hasn't heard those two shows that Dave just mentioned, I highly recommend you check them out because they are both really good episodes. Dave, since you came on last and talked about that Schwenksville case you investigated, what have you been up to?
Well, since the ending of that particular episode, I left the Philadelphia area and decided to spend my summer in northeastern Vermont.
Since you've been in Vermont, you've been pretty active in the dogman field. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I hadn't intended on that, I'll tell you. I had intended on coming up in Vermont, in this area, and spending as much time relaxing as I possibly could. But it would appear that Dogman has followed me here, in a sense. My name and my contact information is out there. And when I got up here and I had settled in, I received a couple of phone calls from people who wanted to have investigations done in and around their properties.
How fast this is moving seems to be taking you by surprise. I can understand that feeling, but when you consider how good of a job you've done when you've been on the show, I guess you shouldn't be all that surprised. Speaking of that, you recently were surprised when more than one person who you didn't know approached you and said, "You're Dave Leidy, right? Please tell us about that."
Yeah, I was out with several different people doing different activities, camping and some other researching. And sometimes when there was a dull moment and people were off by themselves, I had this one guy come up to me and he said, "Hey, you're Dave Leidy, aren't you?" And I thought, "Oh, what is this?" He went on to say that he had heard the podcast, he had heard the episodes from the show, and he wanted to know about it, he said it had affected him greatly, and we had to talk about it. And then that was pretty interesting. And after that, I had another guy do exactly the same thing, and I was kind of ready for it this time. And he told me that he was affected by it, and that he also had an encounter, and he didn't know what to do with it. So listening to me and then meeting me gave him an opportunity to get involved in investigating it.
Having something like that happen to you once where someone that you didn't know approached you and said that to you, that'd be one thing. But the second time around that it happened, it really had to blow you away.
Yeah, that's true. The third time was pretty interesting too.
Yeah, that's probably going to be pretty hard to get used to, but I can understand it. Since the first show we did together, how many eyewitnesses have contacted you?
Well, there was the couple from Schwenksville, and then there's a gentleman that lives in the eastern Pennsylvania area that I have spoken to twice, but I haven't been able to visit him as yet. And since I've been in Vermont, I've had two people up here contact me and want to have their situation investigated.
From what I understand, of the 2 cases in Vermont, one you have yet to investigate, the other one you already have. What can you tell us about the case you have investigated?
Well, like I said, I had come up to Vermont thinking I was going to relax. My wife and I and our dog Kaiser up to our place in northeast Vermont. It's a nice log home on about 15 acres. I'll tell you, if you've never been to Vermont, you should go. Weather's perfect. People are perfect. Well, like I said, I thought I was going to come up and relax. The summers in Vermont, about 100 days, so a little tough to get used to, but definitely makes up for it. So, like I said, originally I had planned on just coming up and relaxing, but I did get a phone call when I was up here from the North American Dogman Project, and they had asked me to field calls if any had come my way. So, with that, I'm really happy to be working for them and helping people who might be having trouble with the whole thing. So anyway, I figured I could cover at least the whole northeast corner of Vermont, depending on where these calls came from. I didn't think I'd get any, but I was wrong. As it turned out, the one that I did check out was near the northeast Canadian border, somewhere near Averill. The other one was about an hour southeast, maybe near, if I had to put a town on it, I'd say Hardwick. So I drove to meet this guy. His name was Keno, and he lives a few miles from the Canadian border near what he said was the Continental Divide. I had no idea that there was such a thing as a Continental Divide in Vermont. Still not quite sure that there is, but that's what people call it up there. When you're up there, at one point, you stand on this ridge line between 2 lakes, and the river, or the water from the stream, runs in 2 different directions. One goes east into the one lake, and the other water runs west into the other lake, and they call it the Continental Divide. I don't know what that is. But this guy had a great log home on 53 acres of land. Everything on it was completely off the grid. He had water and wind and solar power. The other thing that really impressed me about his house was that he had an observatory. And he told me that on clear nights he could sit up in the observatory, and if the stars were right, he could see the colors of the northern lights, which I thought was pretty cool. He said he bought the place about 6 or 7 years ago, and he lives there by himself with his 2 dogs. Like me, he occasionally has friends come over and stay as long as they wish, and he also has a pretty nice on-off road truck and ATVs and snow machines, and these are the kind of things you definitely need in that area. So we sat and we talked about all kinds of things, and we talked about his encounter. He told me that nothing really strange had ever happened until recently. He said he sits down at the house at night and drives around his ATV, and everything's pretty normal. And he said this one time he decided that he was going to go solo camping in a small trailer. And he said he camped about 15 miles from his house in some woods just over the New Hampshire border. After a couple of days, while he was camping there, he went out to collect some wood. He was out near an old quarry, and he thought he saw a dark figure walk into the tree line. And he said he got a pretty good look at it, and he got kind of frightened. He started to second guess himself. He said it looked like an upright walking wolf or a dog. And at this point he said something strange to me in French. He said that it was a loup-garou. I had never heard of that before, and I asked him to spell it. He said it was spelled Loup-Garou. It was a loup-garou. I'd heard of something called a rougarou, but I'd never heard of this one. And he went on to recount this whole French legend about the loup-garou. He said that the word loup is a French word that means wolf, and garou is an old Frankish word similar to werewolf. He said the legend says that when a person contacts a loup-garou and it draws blood, the loup-garou changes back to a human form, but the victim then becomes a loup-garou for 101 days. If that guy talks about it to anyone, he becomes a loup-garou forever, and if he doesn't, he'll turn back to a human. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Never heard anything like that before. Anyway, he said he didn't chase it. He decided he might be wrong. Maybe it was a bear. So he went back to his campsite. During the night, he heard snarling and a howl. And a bit later, he heard some scratching on the trees, and he heard some things being moved around after he had gone back into his trailer. Looking out his window, he said he didn't see anything obvious, but some blurred movement. So the next morning, he got up, he went outside, he found that the blur was that all his camp furniture had been thrown into the woods. The scratching that he heard was a lot like the way bears scratch trees, except the scratching was through the bark and deep into the tree. And he said that he always thought that the bears would remove the bark from the tree. So he thought that was really strange. He also found some damage to his truck. So he decided that he would cut his trip short and go home that day. So he took the long route through some of the back dirt roads of Vermont and thought about what was going on as he was driving back there and got on home. Those back roads of Vermont are pretty interesting. They go past old and new hunting camps. They follow the power lines. And some of them even come out at old radar bases. So you can get seriously lost back there. There's no markings or anything. So it's pretty cool place to go. I personally spent a lot of time on those roads. It's really a great way to spend the day. You never really see anybody else, and you forever lose and find yourself all day long. Just ride around getting lost all the time. It's good to have a truck, though, I'll tell you that. Besides being lazy, watching moose, and going out to rural gun ranges, fishing, paddling around, I love to explore Vermont. It really justifies all the money I spend on my truck. After a while, it might even prove their worth to my wife. So exploring, it really lets you know how vast and remote and how unknown the whole area is. I've seen a lot of animals out there. I've seen all kinds of stuff. This one time I was up by Canada on a power line road, and within 20 minutes I saw a mountain lion, a bear, and a bobcat. So this stuff is out there. If you're slow and if you're quiet, it'll show itself to you. But it also lets you know how remote you are. But it's rare. Moose, deer, bear, you see most of that. Fisher cats, they're around, but you don't see them much. You just hear them. Middle of the night, it sounds like something's axe murdered in the trees. So, anyway, Kino says he took these roads home during the day, and he admitted that his imagination had him seeing dark figures in every tree line. And what he said is he never felt that way before. He had lived in the area for 7 years, and never before had he felt the slightest trepidation about being there. So, after about a week at home, he had almost forgotten about it. A neighbor asked him soon if he had seen anything weird. So before he could answer, the neighbor told him about all this snarling and howling and a few fresh deer kills by the woods where this other guy was camping. So he drove to the guy's house about 5 miles away, and they went to the camp, and they saw the deer kills, and while they were standing there, they thought they heard a snarl coming from the woods. Kino told me, he said he'd been growled at before by various creatures. Skunks and fisher cats sometimes growl at you. He said, but this was different. He said to me that it sounded like steam escaping from a water vessel. They decided to get out of there and think about it. They considered calling the police or the game warden, but decided against that. They both were Squatch guys, and they thought it might have been a crypto. The neighbor said that he knew a guy that worked for a crypto group, and that's how I got involved. So, when I arrived, I talked to Kino and I assured him that the North American Dogman Project would take him seriously. We'd respect everything about the issue and try and help him. He wanted to know what it was and how to keep it from his area. None of us really ever heard of anything up here, except maybe Sasquatch. I know that decades ago there were some disappearances near Bennington, Vermont, but not much after that. So, at this point, I decided to check it out. I wrote up the initial report with Kino, and I decided that I was going to take a look in the area. It might be nothing. No one had really seen anything. I mean, not anything for sure. So, I went with him and the neighbor, and we checked out the deer kills at the camp, and couldn't really tell if anything other than a normal predator had done that. I mean, there weren't any tracks. There wasn't anything that would have said anything different. So I was going to go out, and I decided to bring my friend Ernest with me. We talked about it, and we said we were going to go and do some camping in the area and see what we'd see. So we brought our supplies, camping gear, fishing gear. He brought his bass boat, and it's a good chance we'd maybe get some fish, maybe some trout or perch, walleye, landlocked salmon. There's all kinds of stuff around there. So we did that, and of course we also brought some weapons. I had since upgraded my .357 to a .44, and Ernest had a Desert Eagle 50 caliber, and I thought, oh, that's good. He also was bringing a lever action 30-30. So we went to the range beforehand, day beforehand, and decided to hone our skills a little bit. So the other thing we need to do is to approach this in a methodical manner. First, I wanted to make sure what we were dealing with. I always go into these encounters with the idea that the issue is completely unexplainable, then go from there. Ernest was telling me about coy dogs. So apparently in Vermont, coyotes have bred with local wild dogs, and the result is a larger, rather fearless coyote with no fear of humans. And that's pretty scary, but not the Dogman. So we decided to drive the back roads. The first place we were going to stop was a Vermont state park that we knew, and try that first. The first day and night, we didn't encounter anything. We didn't have any fish either, but we camped, a nice fire, nice food, slept peacefully through the night. The only noise was the other campers around us. So next morning we broke camp and moved on and camped in the backwoods that I had described before. Deep, dark, and wild in those roads back there. But still nothing. The only thing that we really encountered was there was 4 guys went by on horses who said they were camping nearby. Woods were quiet. Still, mist clinging to low areas. Just normal Vermont environments. The only thing we heard was a couple of night birds, great horned owl, insects, small mammals, stuff you'd expect to hear. So, again, we just had a cooking fire, let it go out. Good night's sleep. Third night, we camped in a cornfield just over the New Hampshire border. And I got to tell you, that was the weirdest camping of my entire life. I had camped all over the place, in all kinds of different areas, and I will never camp in another cornfield. I got to tell you that. It was just odd. You're in the middle of the cornfield, and nothing around you but corn stalks. And the noise comes from all different areas. The surprised creatures run in and out of the area that you are, and the light filters down in odd ways. You would never think that a cornfield would be that odd, but I got to tell you, never again. So just before we were bedding down for the night for that, well, that's another thing. Are we bedding down for the night, or are we sleeping on corn stalks? Well, either way. We were just about to drop off to sleep, and we heard one very long, distant howl. That was weird. But, again, we dropped off to sleep. So we thought maybe it could have been a coy dog after he was just talking about that and what our conversation was on earlier. But, again, we dropped off to sleep. The next day, we broke camp as much as it was, and we traveled off maybe like northeast of the campground we were at, the cornfield we were at. And we were just meandering through the back roads of New Hampshire now. So we found our way to the edge of a decent-sized lake. Ernest called this place the Gore, and I thought that was interesting. And I asked him what that meant. He said that a gore is a place that exists because of a mistake made by a colonial surveyor. He said originally the land was owned by no one, but technically the state had taken control of it, but still was basically uninhabited. There was something else out here. The place was pretty remote, but it showed signs of recent logging activity. A lot of times a landowner will sell an acre or two of hardwood deep in the woods, clear it, and then replant it. That way the clear cut isn't really noticeable, except from the air. Then after about 20 years or so, it's well on its way to growing back. So I'd say that most of the timber on the East Coast was cut down from wherever it was, virgin forest, over the last 200 years. To say that there's very few old-growth stands anywhere on the East Coast is probably saying something. I know there's pockets. I know there's a great pocket of hemlocks in Pennsylvania, Cook Forest, and there's some other areas that have been reserved, but not many. So this place was old. It looked though it hadn't been cut in about 100 years, and that's pretty rare. I mean, usually every 40 or 50 years is more like it, it'll stand, but maybe it's because it was a gore. Who knows? Some places in this gore were really thick, and it looked like they hadn't been touched at all. But there was also some recent activity. It looked as though like about an acre was cut, and then they started on the second acre and then just stopped. There were cut trees laying there, and a couple of them had some branches lopped off, but even weirder, some of the tools were left on the ground. Ernest and I looked at each other and thought, uh-oh. I mean, I'd seen that once in a haunted house where the workers had just dropped their stuff and ran when something spooked them. And this felt just like that. It was a really creepy feeling that we hadn't really noticed before. Kind of a semi-watched feeling. So we were up all night because we'd already been spooked, and we had a nice bonfire going, and there was a lot of old cut seasoned wood lying around, so we sat up talking. And a little later in the night, we heard a barred owl in the distance, and he was answered by a much closer one, and we were listening to them for a while. Then the wind picked up, and I'll tell you, the wind picked up and the fire shadows looked really weird. The shadows were dancing around and kind of freaking us out. They looked really bizarre. And then, after a while, the wind died down, and just then the owl sounded off loud and really close. Warning hoots scared the crap out of us. He did it about 8 or 9 times, and then he stopped. So, slowly the regular noises came back, and we started to relax. And after about 20 minutes, all the noise stopped. Silence. We looked at each other. Hair stood up on the back of my neck. We heard a snarl. So I snapped my holster. We started to hear crunching noises, sticks snapping, breathing sounds. I mouthed to Ernest, "Bear?" And he shook his head. And I nodded, and he still shook his head. And I was hoping bear, but I kind of knew they were all vegetarians around here. Not that they wouldn't pass up meat, but that wasn't very usual for them. So I shrugged. And what else? Humans? Maybe. Then no noise again. Complete silence. Felt like we were being watched. Definitely watched. Intently. It lasted for over an hour. Then the forest noise would start up again. And then it would stop again. And it was weird. It went on like this all night long. There was no way we were sleeping this night. So this thing went on and off, like I said, all night long. So we kept the fire going strong, and we just kept looking around. We'd hear low snarls. Once in a while, we'd hear a sound like metal being smacked, but couldn't really see anything. So just about dawn, all the forest noise came back up like a switch was thrown. And everything seemed normal. By this time, we were totally wired. So we decided to fish instead of sleep. I mean, we were wired up. We were wound. We were freaked. We were delirious. Take your pick. But we launched the bass boat, and we went out maybe 100 yards from shore. So we were out there about 2 hours. No bites. It was maybe 9 o'clock in the morning by this time. I was just starting to think that something was nibbling my bait, and I got Ernest's attention. I saw a dark shape over by the truck in our campsite. And we both got a real good look at it. I'd say we were about 40 yards out, drifting in. At first, we thought it was a dog, and then we thought it was a bear. It disappeared, and just as we started to think it disappeared, it showed itself again. It came right out toward the shoreline, kind of half hidden by the bushes. It looked like it didn't see us. It was bent over, and then it just kind of stood up. There was no popping sound at all. It just stood up. Maybe it was already up. It moved a big, large tree branch out of its way like it was nothing. And then it looked right at us. It was like a knife to my stomach. There was intelligence in that look. It was about 8 feet tall, maybe 3 feet wide at the shoulder. It had a German Shepherd type head, a very pointed kind of fuzzy ears on top of its head, and a long muzzle. It had muscular arms and legs and kind of a thin body. It was black, kind of furry. And the fur was thick around its head and shoulders, but thin around its stomach. I really couldn't see its backside, but I could see a tail hanging behind it, kind of between his legs. We couldn't really tell eye color, and they weren't really glowing, but it was pretty bright daylight, so maybe we just couldn't tell. Couldn't see his feet, but his paws were more like hands with long claws on each finger. I just really was kind of in a state of shock. It was broad daylight, and we were seeing this thing. And another weird thing is it seemed to have like darkness around it. It wasn't like a cloud or anything. It just looked kind of fuzzy. And maybe because of how dark its fur was. The other weird thing is it seemed to have a patch of red on its right shoulder. I mean, we were still about 40 yards out, but you could see it. It looked like a bright red spot on his shoulder, and it didn't look like fur. It sort of looked like a piece of cloth about 4 inches in diameter, maybe rectangle shaped. I couldn't see it very well, but it was definitely red. So it stood there for about 2 more minutes by a tree. We were looking at it, and it's looking at us. It showed its fangs, made a growling, kind of a gurgling noise, looked both ways, shook a little bit like a dog does, and then just took off running. We thought about staying right there in the boat for the rest of the day. But after a few minutes, we came in. And we brought the boat in, and we looked around. We didn't see anything. We went down to where he was standing by the lake, and we saw one track, and it had to be his. It was pretty fresh. They looked like wolf tracks, but kind of bigger. The ground was rocky and dry except by the water, so we found one good one. So we looked back up in the woods where we thought it went, but there was nothing there, and we went down the path a ways, but nothing there either, and we decided against tracking. Maybe if we had more people, we could have. Maybe not. At this point, we decided to pack it up and go. That's when we noticed there was damage to the truck. It was really kind of weird. There was these matching crunch marks, like someone had pinched the back of the bed rails together. And there was a big dent, like someone had kicked the body in right above the tailpipe. Well, we took pictures of everything, and we took some notes, and decided to pack it in and head home. Had a lot to think about, a lot to write up.
That is a lot to write up. From what I understand, you took a lot of photos through all this experience, and consequently, we'll be posting those on the YouTube version of the show.
Yes, I took a ton of pictures. I don't even know whether I can fit all the pictures I took in, so I'm going to do my best and try and just put up the pertinent ones.
That sounds good. Yeah, send the ones you can, and we'll definitely get those posted for you.
I mean, thing about research and thing about photographs is we don't always, as researchers, post all of our research on the internet. Some things we just don't put on for all of the public to take a look at. Some of it's in the file, but there's definitely some things that people should see.
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of people out there listening that are looking forward to seeing those photos, so thanks again for sharing those. With regards to that dogman you saw on the bank that day, how did it compare in appearance to the ones you saw in North Carolina in the swamp?
Well, I got to say that they were similar in that the shape of the head. When I was in North Carolina, it was dark, of course. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning, but the head was the same. It was still a German Shepherd type head. Ears on the top of the head, pointed ears. Same thing with this guy, but this guy in Vermont, or well, New Hampshire, I'd say, he kind of looked bigger. He looked taller. He looked wider. He looked darker. Something about this one just seemed a bit, if it was possible, to be more menacing.
Considering the fact that the ones in the swamp in North Carolina were seemingly trying to surround you, what was it about what this one did here in Vermont that makes you think it might have been more menacing in its actions?
Well, it was by itself, that I know of. I'm not sure whether I could say that its actions would be what I would say was more menacing. I'd say its behavior. The ones in North Carolina seem to be exhibiting some kind of a pack behavior, the same way a wild dogs might. But the one that we saw in Vermont seemed to be focused more in a strange way.
That makes sense. You talked about how when you went back to look for footprints and you found the one that you took a close look at, you told me in the pre-interview that print had a strange quality that really perplexed you. What quality was that?
Well, we went back to look for tracks, and like I said, the ground was pretty rocky, but down by the lake it was pretty muddy. So there was a couple of tracks out there. We could see small mammals, maybe muskrat or raccoon, things like that, down by another section. But where this guy was standing, there was one pretty clear print. And what I thought was strange was that you could see the pad mark of where the foot was, but the main pad, but the finger pads seemed to be more splayed out than I would imagine that a canine type print would look like. All canine prints I had seen in the past, wolf prints, coyote prints, anything like that, the pads, the finger pads were usually pretty close together. But this one, they were pretty spread apart, almost like a mountain lion print. But it definitely wasn't, because it had the correct single pad and claw marks.
You mentioning the fact that those toes were splayed like that, it might seem strange, but it's actually what I would expect. I think that's a compensation device to help them balance better on feet that are more designed for quadrupedal locomotion.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. If you think about a dog or a wolf or any creature that usually walks on four legs, it distributes its weight completely differently than when it would be on two legs. Maybe that does make a lot of sense.
I think that has a lot to do with it. As that dogman was standing there on the bank looking at you, did you notice it making any strange movements?
No, I don't think so. Like I said, in my previous encounters, I had seen a strange movement when they actually stood up. In my first encounter, when he stood up, it didn't seem natural for him to stand up. His legs popped into place, and it seemed to really have to think about standing up. That's why I thought that this particular one may have already been up and was just crouching over a little bit. So when he stood up, it didn't seem to be out of place. And while he was standing there, he was looking around, but it didn't seem to be unnatural in his way. He seemed to be pretty comfortable standing there.
Well, that's interesting. As you're watching this thing move around your campsite, did it seem to be moving with a purpose, or did it just seem to be there with no particular goal in mind?
Well, it was kind of hard to tell. I don't know how long it had been there before I noticed it. We were out on the lake, and I looked in, I saw the shadow, and I got Ernest's attention when we looked at it. So I'm not sure how long he had been there. And I say he, I really don't know, but I don't know how long he had been there before we noticed him. But he seemed to be checking the campsite. He wasn't standing in one place and looking around. He seemed to be walking around the campsite, bending over and looking around.
I hope he wasn't looking for you.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, when he came out onto the bank, he didn't seem to see us at first, so I want to think that if he was looking for me, he would have come out and maybe spotted us right away. But like you said, he definitely seemed to be looking for something. But from what it was, it seemed to be something closer to the ground.
I guess you can't think for them. You never know what's going to motivate them to do one thing or the other, so we're just going to have to wonder on that. Something I'm also wondering about, though, is this dark aura you talked about seeing around this thing. You mentioned that it might have been a quality of its fur, making it just appear that way, but if you had to say, do you think it was more than likely some form of an aura around this creature, or do you think it was more than likely the quality in its fur making it appear that way?
Well, I can't say for certain, and I know it doesn't make a lot of sense, but at first it seemed to just be a dark fuzzy fur that was surrounding it. But the more I looked at it, the more it seemed like it was actually a little dark around the outline of its body rather than just the darkness of its fur.
That had to be so creepy to see.
It was really, really weird. I really didn't know how to explain that. I had said that the first time I had seen Dogman in the swamps of North Carolina, it had yellow glowing eyes. This guy's eyes weren't glowing at all, and I really couldn't tell what color they were. They didn't seem to stand out. But if something was to stand out, it was the fact that there seemed to be an outline around this guy.
That had to be so hard to get over. To this day, is Kino still convinced it was a loup-garou, or what's his take on it now?
Well, after we left and we broke camp and we went back and talked to Kino, I did not say to him that we had positively encountered a dogman. I told him that we had a possible encounter. From what I told him, he seemed convinced, or at least partially convinced, that what we had possibly seen was the loup-garou in his mind, in his description. And what I told him was, whether it was or not, he should continue with his normal activities and just be as careful as he always was, and maybe a little bit more, just thinking that there may be other creatures in that section of Vermont anyway, and he'd need to be more careful.
I'm sure in a way when Kino called you in, he was hoping you would turn up some evidence, but when you came back that day and reported actually having your own encounter, I wonder if that kind of disappointed him in a way, just for the fact that it reinforced his idea that he had some problems there.
It's hard to say. He didn't really give me a lot of feedback in the way of body language, and he didn't have a lot to say. I think that he wanted more of an explanation than the one I gave him. And I don't know whether I would call it disappointment, but I think he wanted more information.
Well, that makes sense. The more you know about something, the more comfortable you normally are with it. When you're talking about something like dogmen or loup-garous or whatever that was out there on the bank that day, since there are so many things about them that we just don't know, I can understand his hunger for information about these things.
Yeah, I told him that it was a possibility, and I told him that he should just go about his business the way he normally would just to be a little bit more careful and possibly armed. If you live in that section of Vermont, there are a lot more larger predators than in the rest of the state, and if you're going to go out and wander around the back roads and in the country, it just makes sense to do that.
Oh, it does make good sense. Did Ernest ever tell you about noticing anything that day while you're looking at it on the bank that you yourself hadn't noticed?
Ernest and I compared a lot of notes after the encounter, and I was kind of happy to talk to him because I had been with other researchers that didn't want to talk about it at all. We went back and forth about what he had seen and what I had seen, and I would say that most, if not all, of what we had seen matched each other's descriptions.
Well, it was daylight, and both of you were so close to it, that only makes sense, so I guess I'm not all that surprised. My last question for you, Dave, before we get out of here is, you more so than most people are familiar with the fact that most people in the Sasquatch field, as far as investigators would go, it seems like most of them kind of shun the idea of dogmen being a reality. What would you tell someone who doesn't believe your story about what you experienced that day or about the encounter you had in the swamp in North Carolina?
I understand somewhat where the Sasquatch guys are coming from, being partially that way myself. I don't think it's a really good thing in anything you do to follow one thing in one direction. I have met a lot of guys involved in Sasquatch that told me that it wasn't so much that they didn't want to believe in Dogman. It was more that they were more interested in Sasquatch and they had devoted themselves to that, and that's what they were concentrating on. I understood that, and I respect that. But at the same time, I would tell them that they need to just keep themselves open to other aspects.
I can't thank you enough for doing what you do, and I can't thank you enough for coming on the show tonight with so little notice. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Vic. Anytime.
Thanks again so much, and have a great night.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye.